right now, millions of people, and honestly, probably you listening right now, are walking around with a smartwatch on their wrist.
Oh, absolutely.
And we are just like terrified that closing those little activity rings is the only thing standing between us and total health failure.
Right. It's this complete obsession with the gamification of our own biology.
Exactly. But what if the very tools and, the mental frameworks we use to track our wellness are the exact things spiking our cortisol?
Yeah, shutting down our digestion.
And fundamentally sabotaging our metabolisms.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the deep dive. We know you, our listener, are constantly trying to stay well-informed, right?
Always trying to figure out how things actually work under the hood.
Yeah, but preferably without drowning in that relentless, completely contradictory information overload that basically defines the modern wellness industry today.
I mean, the sheer volume of data we are expected to process just to decide what to eat for breakfast is staggering.
It's ridiculous.
It creates this sort of paralysis by analysis, where we just abandon our own internal signals in favor of whatever the latest internet headline dictates.
Which brings us to today's remarkably unusual source material. We aren't dissecting some medical journal or a manifesto from a Silicon Valley biohacker today.
No, not at all, which is refreshing.
Very. We are actually looking at a transcript from an advanced English language learning show called Advanced Learner Studio.
Hosted by two people named Emma and John.
Right. And ostensibly, this audio is just designed to teach C2 level, like highly advanced English vocabulary and conversational flow to non-native speakers.
But when you strip away that educational framing and really look at the actual content of what Emma and John are discussing, it is a devastatingly concise masterclass.
It really is.
On navigating modern health, wellness, and sustainable habits. It operates almost as a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse? How do you mean?
Well, because Emma and John are focusing on teaching high-level vocabulary, they use incredibly precise descriptive language to articulate the exact traps we fall into.
Oh, right, because they have to explain the definitions through context.
Exactly. They take words like insidious, panacea, and ubiquitous, and map them perfectly onto the physiological and psychological realities of trying to stay healthy.
In a world that is essentially engineered to make us sick.
Precisely.
So our mission today is to extract this hidden blueprint. We are going to break down the specific actionable strategies discussed in the source so you can bypass all that commercialized noise.
And really understand the core mechanics of lasting well-being.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the very first concept they tackle is something John refers to as the graveyard of good intentions.
Oof. That phrase just hits incredibly close to home.
So close. He describes having cupboards full of these expensive superfood supplements that he used for maybe a week.
Right, and a trail of abandoned gym memberships.
Yeah. I look at that graveyard of half-empty protein powders and dusty stationary bikes as almost an archaeological dig of our past, overly optimistic selves.
That is a phenomenal metaphor, because it forces us to confront the physical evidence of our behavioral failure.
Exactly. Like if you look at the different strata of that graveyard, you can trace the history of wellness marketing.
Oh, for sure.
There is the low-fat era, the keto era, the 30-day cleanse era. Each abandoned product is just this monument to our desperation for a quick fix.
We buy these things thinking, this is the intervention that will finally change my life.
But Emma, the host in the source, completely deflates this approach. She uses the word panacea, a cure-all, and states emphatically that in human biology, there is no such thing.
None. And the reason we end up with this graveyard is that we're relying entirely on willpower to force these extreme changes.
Right.
And willpower is a finite, highly unstable resource. We really need to look at the neurology of what Emma is describing here.
Let's do it. Break it down.
So the wellness industry sells us this narrative that failing a diet is a moral failing. Like, you just lacked discipline.
Which feels terrible, by the way.
It does. But willpower is governed heavily by the prefrontal cortex, which is the area of your brain responsible for executive function.
Long-term planning, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Long-term planning and suppressing immediate impulses. Now, that region of the brain requires an immense amount of metabolic energy to function.
So it's burning calories just to say no to things.
Right. Every time you make a decision, every time you say, suppress frustration during a tedious Zoom call.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Right. Every time you navigate heavy traffic, you are burning through the glucose required to keep that prefrontal cortex online. It is quite literally a battery.
So by 5 p.m., after a full day of white-knuckling through a corporate job, that battery isn't just slow, it is entirely dead.
It's totally offline.
Right.
And when the prefrontal cortex dims, the more primitive, emotion-driven parts of your brain just take over the steering wheel.
And those parts don't care about the future.
Not at all. Those areas do not care about your cardiovascular health 10 years from now. They care about immediate comfort, caloric density, and avoiding discomfort right now.
Okay, but let me push back on the implications of that, though.
Sure.
If willpower is a biologically finite resource, and it naturally depletes by the end of the workday for almost everyone, are we just biologically doomed to fail if we work a standard 9-to-5 job?
It's a fair question.
Because most of society operates on a schedule that guarantees our prefrontal cortex is tapped out exactly at the moment we are supposed to be, making a complex, healthy dinner or driving to a crowded gym.
That structural conflict is exactly why the graveyard exists. We are not doomed to fail, but we are doomed to fail if we keep using the all-or-nothing framework.
Right.
Emma points out that human biology vehemently resists extreme, sudden changes. It interprets massive caloric restriction or sudden punishing physical exertion as an environmental threat.
Like a famine or a predator, not a health initiative.
Exactly. So when you try to force an extreme routine using a depleted resource like willpower, your biology actively fights back.
So the solution isn't to somehow manufacture more willpower.
No, the solution is to abandon strategies that require it in the first place.
If willpower is a dead end, we need a backdoor into our own biology. And the source provides a fascinating one. Emma introduces the concept of holistic integration.
Specifically using the term exercise snacks.
Yes, exercise snacks. This is where we shift from looking at health as an isolated, punishing event to viewing it as a continuous, low-friction state of being.
I love how she frames this.
She makes a really visceral comparison here. She says that pursuing fitness in isolated bursts, like suffering through a brutal 30-day boot camp while otherwise changing nothing about your lifestyle, is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Yeah.
And the bullet wound, in her analogy, is our sedentary baseline.
It's so true. Emma and John discuss our ubiquitous, desk-bound existence.
We sit for 10 hours at work, we commute sitting down, we relax on the couch.
And Emma argues that you simply cannot counteract 10 hours of passive sitting with 45 minutes of frantic cardio at the end of the day.
To understand why the Band-Aid metaphor works, we have to look at what happens in the body during prolonged immobility.
Yeah, let's get into that. Because when you sit for hours on end, your body enters a very specific, dormant metabolic state. The electrical activity in your leg muscles shuts off completely.
Completely.
Yes. Your calorie burning rate drops to about 1 calorie per minute. But most crucially, the production of an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, which is responsible for vacuuming fat out of your bloodstream, that enzyme drops by up to 90%.
Wait, really? So the fat literally just stays in the blood, circulating, because the mechanism to clear it has been switched off by sitting.
Yes, it just sits there. And going from that completely dormant, metabolically stagnant state straight into an hour of maximum intensity interval training is a massive shock to the system.
I can imagine.
While that intense cardio has benefits, it does not retroactively turn on the enzymes that were suppressed for the previous 10 hours. It doesn't undo the vascular damage of chronic immobility.
This is where the exercise snacks come in. Emma suggests abandoning the grueling gym session if it fills you with dread.
Exactly. If it requires willpower, ditch it.
And instead focus on short, frequent bursts of movement. Taking the stairs, doing a brisk 15-minute walk after lunch, or even just doing some deep stretches while watching television.
The goal is perpetual low-level movement because consistency trumps intensity every single time.
I find this incredibly appealing because it lowers the barrier to entry so drastically that you bypass the willpower problem entirely.
Absolutely.
But I do have a hard time believing that a 15-minute walk or, a few calf raises while the kettle boils actually yields dividends if your goal is serious long-term cardiovascular health.
You're skeptical.
Yeah. How does that compare to lifting heavy weights or doing dedicated threshold training?
Well, it's important to differentiate between training for peak athletic performance and training for baseline longevity and health span.
Okay, that makes sense.
John realizes during the conversation that the goal is to be actively engaged in living a dynamic life. What's fascinating here is that when you intersperse your day with movement, you prevent that lipoprotein lipase from shutting down.
Ah, so you keep the vacuum running, so to speak.
Exactly. You maintain insulin sensitivity throughout the entire day rather than just in a brief post-workout window. You are fundamentally shifting your physiological baseline from sedentary to active.
So even if it's light movement, it's about the frequency.
Right. Because if heavy lifting is something you dread, something that requires immense willpower to initiate and ultimately lands in the graveyard of good intentions, its actual health value to you over a 10-year horizon is 0.
Wow. Yeah, 0 multiplied by heavy weights is still 0.
Exactly. The physiological benefit of a perfect routine you quit after a month is infinitely less than an imperfect, low-level routine you sustain for decades.
I see the logic. You are changing your baseline identity without triggering the body's alarm system that resists extreme change. But, you can't even initiate an exercise snack if your underlying energy systems are completely destroyed.
This is so true.
And this is where the transcript takes a very sharp turn. Emma and John move from movement to the absolute bedrock of human health, the insidious nature of hustle culture and sleep hygiene.
If movement is the output, we have to examine the input. And modern society is actively hostile to restorative energy input.
It really is. Emma points out how society glorifies burning the candle at both ends. Working late, waking up at dawn to grind, running on pure caffeine and adrenaline.
We wear exhaustion as a badge of honor.
We really do. But she deliberately uses the word insidious to describe chronic sleep deprivation. And in an English learning context, insidious implies something that is gradually and secretly causing harm.
It's not a sudden catastrophe, it's a slow rot.
Exactly. She explains that skipping sleep doesn't just make you tired. It impairs cognitive function, severely spikes cortisol levels, and fundamentally sabotages your metabolism.
Let's drill down into that cortisol spike, because it explains so many of the downstream failures we experience.
Yeah, explain that, because cortisol is known as the stress hormone, right?
Right. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone. Its primary evolutionary function is to manage stress and mobilize energy. When you are chronically sleep deprived, your body interprets that exhaustion not as a lifestyle choice, but as an environmental threat.
Like it thinks you're being hunted.
Exactly. It assumes you must be staying awake because you are in danger, so it pumps out cortisol to keep you alert.
Okay, makes sense for survival.
But high sustained levels of cortisol wreak absolute havoc on your insulin receptors. It effectively makes your cells resistant to insulin, meaning glucose cannot efficiently enter the cells to be used for energy.
Wait, so if the glucose can't get into the cells because cortisol is blocking the way, where does it go?
It stays in the bloodstream. Your blood sugar remains elevated, which prompts your body to store that excess energy as fat, particularly visceral fat around the organs.
Oh.
Simultaneously, because the cells aren't getting the glucose they need, they send starvation signals to the brain.
Which perfectly explains John's epiphany in the transcript. He says, when I'm exhausted, my craving for sugary processed foods goes through the roof. It's like my brain is screaming for a quick dopamine hit.
And Emma validates this completely, telling him it isn't a lack of discipline, it's a direct biological cry for accessible energy.
That is wild.
If your cells are starved because cortisol has induced insulin resistance, your brain wants the most rapidly digestible energy source available, which is simple carbohydrates and sugar.
Right.
And it wants the accompanying dopamine rush to momentarily lift the heavy fog of sleep deprivation. When you are standing in your kitchen at 10 p.m. eating cookies, it is not a moral failing.
It's biology.
It is your biology executing a survival mechanism triggered by the fact that you only slept 5 hours the night before.
So attempting to out-train or out-diet a terrible sleep schedule is like trying to drive a luxury sports car on 4 flat tires.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, you can pour premium fuel into the tank all you want, but the underlying mechanics of the vehicle are fundamentally compromised. No matter how hard you hit the gas with a new diet, you're not going anywhere.
Exactly. The golden rule from the source is that you must honor your circadian rhythm first. You have to inflate the tires before you worry about the fuel.
And that requires a radical reprioritization. We often view sleep as the flexible variable, the thing we cut into to make time for work, or even for an early morning workout.
But the transcript argues that sleep is the non-negotiable anchor. Without it, the willpower battery never recharges, and the hormonal environment makes healthy eating physiologically impossible.
Which naturally brings us to the minefield of nutrition. If sleep deprivation puts our brain in a state where it's actively hunting for cheap dopamine and fast sugar, it makes perfect sense why the modern grocery store is essentially designed to exploit a tired person.
Oh, the environment is completely engineered against us. And the source spends a significant amount of time dissecting the psychological traps of modern dieting.
And the linguistic focus of the source is really interesting here too, because they discuss how the wellness industry relies on highly charged, moralistic vocabulary to describe food.
Exactly. Emma talks about the history of vilifying specific macronutrients.
First, fats were deemed evil.
Right, leading to shelves full of low-fat products that were packed with sugar to compensate for the lost flavor.
And then the pendulum swung, and carbohydrates became the ultimate villain.
She argues that this hyperfixation on specific metrics and labeling macronutrients as good or bad is a massive psychological trap.
So what's the alternative?
Instead, the focus should shift to nutrient density, ensuring sufficient fiber, lean protein, and micronutrients, and choosing whole, minimally processed foods.
By focusing on nutrient density rather than macronutrient elimination, you step off the pendulum entirely.
Precisely. The vilification of macronutrients creates a disordered, highly anxious relationship with food. It turns eating into a mathematical equation heavily laden with guilt.
And speaking of mathematical equations, John asks a pivotal question about the role of technology in all this. Since gamification is such a huge part of modern culture, he asks if we should be relying on apps and wearables to biohack our way to better nutrition.
This part is fascinating. Emma describes wellness technology as a massive, double-edged sword.
Right, because wearables that track sleep architecture and heart rate variability, or apps like MyFitnessPal's, are incredible for establishing objective baselines.
They are, but the gamification aspect, the stress of breaking a streak or not closing your daily activity rings, can quickly cause severe anxiety.
It turns health from a pursuit of vitality into a dreaded high-pressure chore.
And the irony is palpable here. If your smartwatch tells you that you are behind on your daily steps and that notification causes a spike in anxiety, you are actively releasing cortisol.
Oh man. So the tool designed to monitor your health is now actively inducing the stress response that drives insulin resistance and sugar cravings.
Exactly. The biohacking tool becomes the stressor.
To combat this, Emma introduces the ultimate goal: intuitive eating.
Right.
The premise is that instead of letting an algorithm dictate your intake, you cultivate deep mindfulness. You sit down, you chew thoroughly, you tune into the actual physiological signals of satiety.
And you actively override the modern default of eating on autopilot while scrolling through emails.
Crucially, she warns against the forbidden fruit psychological trap. If you categorize chocolate as evil and strictly forbid it, you elevate it to a pedestal.
It becomes an obsession, which almost inevitably triggers a massive binge later when your willpower battery inevitably depletes.
The forbidden fruit concept is deeply rooted in behavioral psychology, isn't it?
It is. When you restrict an item, you artificially inflate its reward value in the brain. The restriction creates a psychological tension. Every time you deny yourself the forbidden food, that tension tightens.
Like winding a spring.
Exactly. Until eventually the cognitive load of resisting is too high, the tension snaps, and the resulting binge is far worse than if you had simply allowed yourself a moderate portion in the first place.
So, Emma is advocating for achieving sustainable equilibrium by stripping the moral weight away from food.
Yes. A cookie's not bad, and kale is not good. They just have different nutrient densities.
So what does this all mean? Because I am struggling to reconcile a major contradiction in Emma's advice here.
Okay, lay it on me.
She advocates for intuitive eating, listening to your gut, and removing the moral and mathematical weight from food. But she also praises tracking apps like MyFitnessPal for establishing baselines.
Right.
If I am scanning barcodes and logging every single gram of protein and fiber into a database, I am not listening to my gut. I am listening to my phone. How does the source bridge the gap between hyper-tracking and intuitive eating? Isn't that contradictory?
It looks like a paradox, absolutely, but it is actually a necessary progression, much like learning to play jazz.
Jazz. Okay, I'm listening.
Yep. The ultimate goal of a jazz musician is pure improvisation, right? Playing intuitively, feeling the rhythm, and breaking the formal rules of composition. But you cannot improvise a masterpiece if you do not first understand scales, chord progressions, and basic music theory.
You have to internalize the rigid rules before you can transcend them.
Exactly. In our modern, hyper-processed food environment, our intuition is fundamentally broken. Foods are engineered in laboratories with specific ratios of salt, sugar, and fat, often called the bliss point.
Oh, designed specifically to bypass our natural satiety signals.
Precisely. If you tell someone who has eaten a standard, highly processed diet to suddenly eat intuitively, their hijacked intuition will tell them to eat an entire bag of potato chips. Their hormonal signals are misfiring.
Because the baseline is corrupted.
Yes. So using an app like Chronometer or MyFitnessPal for a limited period, say 3 to 4 weeks, serves as the musical scales. It provides objective, unemotional data.
It teaches you what 30 grams of protein actually looks like on a plate.
Right. It reveals that you are only getting 10 grams of fiber when you need 30. You gather the data, you recalibrate your physical understanding of portion sizes and nutrient density, and then crucially, you put the app away.
Wow.
Once your physiological baseline is corrected and your body is actually receiving adequate nutrition, your true natural hunger and fullness cues come back online. You transition from the rigid mechanics of tracking into the fluid reality of intuitive eating.
That makes the progression incredibly clear. The data recalibrates the instrument, and then you trust the instrument to play the music.
Perfectly said.
But John makes an observation in the transcript that pushes this even further. He notes that obsessing over good versus evil foods doesn't just ruin our diets, creates immense psychological distress.
And this distress provides the perfect bridge into perhaps the most profound section of the source material, the inextricable link between the mind and the body.
This is where Emma expands the definition of health beyond mere physical inputs and outputs, addressing the nervous system's role as the master regulator. She drops a line that is an absolute gut punch.
What is it?
She says, "You cannot be physically thriving if you are psychologically drowning."
That is so powerful.
John admits that chronic stress is the bane of his existence, and he observes that this mental state manifests in very visceral physical ways. Tension headaches, and specifically severe digestive issues.
Emma confirms this connection, explaining that the gut and the brain are in constant bidirectional dialogue via the vagus nerve.
Let's talk about the vagus nerve, because Emma notes that under chronic stress, digestion essentially halts. How exactly does stress override that vagus nerve connection?
To truly grasp why John's digestion fails when he is stressed, we have to look at the vagus nerve's evolutionary function. It is the longest cranial nerve in the body, acting as an information superhighway connecting the brainstem to the heart, lungs, and digestive tract. It is the primary command center for the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs our rest and digest state. It really comes down to resource allocation during a perceived threat.
Meaning the fight or flight response.
Exactly. When you experience stress, your sympathetic nervous system activates. From an evolutionary perspective, if you are being chased by a predator, your body must divert all available resources to immediate survival.
It dilates your pupils, spikes your heart rate, floods your skeletal muscles with glucose so you can run.
Right. And at that exact moment, the complex, energy-intensive process of digesting your lunch is completely irrelevant to your survival.
Your body's basically like, we'll deal with the sandwich later if we survive.
Exactly. So the brain sends a signal down the vagus nerve to aggressively shunt blood flow away from the gastrointestinal tract. Digestion is mechanically and chemically shut down.
The problem being that today, the predator isn't a tiger on the savannah. It's a passive-aggressive email from a boss, an overflowing inbox, or chronic financial anxiety.
And your body cannot distinguish between the stress of a predator and the stress of a deadline. The physiological cascade is identical.
That's terrifying.
If you are chronically stressed, you are locked in a perpetual state of low-grade fight or flight. Blood flow is constantly restricted from your gut. This leads directly to the bloating, the malabsorption of nutrients, and the severe digestive distress John describes.
Meaning you could mathematically optimize your diet, perfectly tracking your macros and consuming the most nutrient-dense organic meal on the planet. But if you are eating it hunched over your keyboard, furiously answering stressful work emails,
your body isn't even processing those nutrients properly.
The psychological state negates the physical input.
It is biological gridlock. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is why Emma insists that incorporating mindfulness, meditation, and deep breathing exercises is not some esoteric woo-woo luxury.
Because it's physiological imperative to unlock the digestive system.
Exactly.
She specifically highlights deep breathing. Why does breathing, of all things, fix the gut?
Because it is a mechanical hack to stimulate the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve passes right through the diaphragm. When you take slow, deep, diaphragmatic breaths, expanding your belly rather than shallowly lifting your chest, you are physically massaging and stimulating that nerve.
Wait, you are physically massaging the nerve with your breath?
Yes. This sends a profound, undeniable signal up the superhighway to the brainstem that the environment is safe. You cannot breathe slowly and deeply if you are running from a tiger.
Wow.
The brain recognizes this mechanical signal, turns off sympathetic fight-or-flight alarm, and re-engages the parasympathetic rest and digest mode. Blood flow returns to the gut. It is a manual override for your nervous system.
That is genuinely incredible. It turns breathing from a vague wellness concept into a mechanical lever you can pull. However, the transcript acknowledges a massive external barrier to achieving this mental equilibrium.
Information overload.
Yes, the labyrinth of online health misinformation. John expresses intense frustration about the whiplash of health media. You know how coffee is hailed as a miracle antioxidant on Monday and condemned as a toxic poison by Friday.
Oh, we've all felt that whiplash.
The sheer volume of conflicting data induces a paralysis that just adds to the chronic stress.
It creates a feedback loop of anxiety. The harder you try to optimize based on internet headlines, the more stressed you become, which further suppresses your vagal tone and ruins your digestion.
Emma offers a two-part solution to this information overload. First, she advises looking only for consensus among credible, peer-reviewed sources and entirely ignoring sensationalist, click-driven headlines.
Good advice.
Second, she tells John he must be his own science experiment to see how his unique biology reacts to different inputs. But I need to play devil's advocate here, though.
Okay, go ahead.
If we established earlier that willpower is finite, and John is already psychologically drowning in stress and exhaustion, isn't telling him to design, run, and analyze science experiments on himself just adding another exhausting, high-pressure task to his already overflowing cognitive plate?
If we view the phrase science experiment through the lens of rigid clinical trials and high-stakes pass-fail metrics, yes, it sounds exhausting. But we have to look at how Emma is reframing the concept of experimentation.
Okay, how is she reframing it?
She is actually extending an invitation to radical self-compassion and objective curiosity, removing the moral weight from the process.
Walk me through that. How does an experiment reduce pressure?
Well, consider the mindset of a bench scientist. If a scientist mixes chemical A with chemical B and it fails to produce the desired reaction, the scientist doesn't internalize that failure.
Right.
They don't go home thinking, I am a weak, undisciplined person because my hypothesis was wrong. They simply record the data. Under these specific conditions, this outcome occurred. Fascinating. Let's adjust a variable and try again tomorrow. Emma is urging John to adopt that exact same objective, guilt-free curiosity toward his own body. You are conducting an N-of-1 trial.
So if a wellness influencer insists that a heavy kale smoothie is the ultimate breakfast, but it leaves you bloated and exhausted all morning,
you don't judge yourself for failing the diet. You simply log the data. Kale smoothies do not align with my specific gastrointestinal microbiome. Your personal data trumps the internet consensus.
That's brilliant.
By framing it as an experiment, you completely detach your self-worth from the outcome. An experiment cannot fail in a moral sense. It can only yield data. This reframing is the ultimate antidote to the anxiety caused by information overload.
It strips away the judgment. It's no longer, I must adhere to these rigid rules or I am a failure, but rather, let's play around with variables and observe what makes me feel energetic.
Exactly.
But to run these low-stakes experiments safely, we need a controlled environment. We can't experiment if we are constantly fighting our surroundings. And this transitions us beautifully to the final and perhaps most impactful section of the transcript.
The absolute necessity of systems, environment, and finding your deep why.
This is the architectural phase of the blueprint. We move from understanding the internal physiology to engineering the external reality of our daily lives. Emma states unequivocally that relying on motivation is a recipe for disaster.
Because motivation is ephemeral. It is a feeling, subject to change, just like happiness or frustration. We must rely on systems instead.
She gives a very practical example. If you want to become a morning runner, you don't wake up and hope you feel motivated. You lay out your running clothes, shoes, and headphones right next to your bed the night before.
You remove the friction of decision-making. You are intentionally designing the path of least resistance. When the alarm goes off and your prefrontal cortex is still groggy, you don't have to use willpower to decide what to wear or where your shoes are. The system carries you through the vulnerable moment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I look at the dynamic between motivation and systems like the difference between the weather and a well-built house.
Oh, I like this. Go on.
Motivation is the weather. It is inherently unpredictable. Someday you wake up and the sun is shining, the temperature is perfect, and you feel highly motivated to tackle the day. Other days, it's a torrential downpour, it's freezing, and your motivation is Absolutely zero. You cannot control the weather.
Right.
Systems, however, are the house. If you take the time to build a strong, structurally sound house with a good roof, you are protected and can function normally, regardless of whether it is sunny or pouring rain outside. The system insulates your habits from the turbulent weather of your emotions.
That analogy perfectly captures the protective nature of habit architecture. And the transcript emphasizes that when building this house, you must start small. You don't try to build a mansion in a weekend. Emma tells John to pick one tiny variable, perhaps drinking an extra liter of water a day, or simply going to bed 30 minutes earlier, and master that before adding anything else. She explicitly warns against the perfectionism that leads to the graveyard of good intentions, reminding him that a single missed workout or an indulgent weekend meal is just a drop in the ocean over a lifelong trajectory.
But this brings up a massive external hurdle. How do we build these protective systems when the world around us, our homes, our offices, our social circles, is seemingly engineered to make us fail?
It's tough.
Emma asks John a probing question about his physical environment, and John has a real epiphany. He realizes that his environment completely dictates his behavior. He admits, if my kitchen is stocked with processed snacks, I will eat them when I am tired. If I have to walk past a bowl of fruit on the counter, I'll grab an apple.
This raises an important question about how we structure our physical spaces to either fight us or support us. This realization is the core of environmental design.
It's profound.
Willpower isn't just depleted by internal stress or decision fatigue at work. It is actively drained by a hostile domestic environment. If you come home exhausted and you have to fight your own pantry every single evening to make a healthy choice, you will eventually lose that fight.
Emma suggests aggressive practical changes. You have to audit your pantry and ruthlessly remove the friction. Keep a visually appealing, massive water bottle directly in your line of sight on your desk to prompt hydration.
You have to engineer your physical space so that the healthy choice requires zero cognitive load and the unhealthy choice requires immense effort.
Right. By removing the junk food from the house, you force yourself to have to put on shoes, find your keys, and drive to a store if you want a sugary snack.
You have inserted massive friction between yourself and the negative habit, bypassing the need for willpower entirely.
But our environment isn't just the physical items in our house. It is the people we surround ourselves with. And the transcript tackles the immense power and the immense pressure of community.
This is such a big deal.
John admits a very vulnerable hurdle. He wants to change his habits, but his social circle revolves entirely around meeting up for pints at the local pub. He expresses a deep fear of judgment and the profound isolation of being the odd one out, the guy ordering sparkling water while everyone else is drinking beer.
The fear of social ostracization is a powerful biological driver.
Right.
We are pack animals. Historically, being separated from the tribe meant death.
Exactly.
The drive to conform to the behavioral norms of our immediate community is often stronger than our drive for personal health optimization.
Emma empathizes with this deeply, but she challenges John to reframe his entire approach to his social life. She tells him to stop viewing his health journey as a series of restrictions, as constantly saying no to his friends, and start viewing it as an expansion of his capabilities.
That's a huge shift.
She pushes him to actively seek out new communities to supplement his existing ones, suggesting he use platforms like Meetup or local Facebook groups to find amateur cycling clubs, hiking groups, or recreational sports leagues.
This is a masterstroke in behavioral integration. By joining a hiking group or a recreational tennis league, you are shifting the focal point of the social interaction away from alcohol and heavy sedentary meals and directing it toward movement.
Crucially, the healthy activity is disguised as social connection and play.
Exactly. When John goes to a tennis league, he isn't using his depleted willpower to force himself to do cardio. He's just going to hang out, laugh, and play a game with his new friends. The cardiovascular benefits become an effortless byproduct of the community.
He also expresses apprehension about trying new things. He asks, what if I try a martial arts class or bouldering, and I am terribly uncoordinated and make a fool of myself?
A very common fear.
Emma's response is blunt and empowering. She basically said, so what? Everyone starts as a novice. It is infinitely better to be the clumsiest, most uncoordinated person in a yoga class than to remain stagnant on the couch out of a paralyzing fear of looking foolish.
Embracing the vulnerability of being a beginner is the only way to achieve that expansion of capabilities she talks about. It requires checking the ego at the door.
Finally, as the transcript wraps up, John asks the ultimate question. If fad diets are a trap, if punishing workouts just end up in the graveyard, and if willpower is a myth, What is the core driver that will keep us on this lifelong trajectory when motivation inevitably fades?
And he answers his own question.
He does. He says you have to find your deep why. He notes that surface-level aesthetic goals, like wanting to fit into a specific pair of jeans for a summer vacation or wanting visible abs, will completely evaporate the moment the weather turns cold and things get difficult.
Vanity metrics lack the emotional gravity required to sustain behavioral change over decades. A pair of jeans will not drag you out of a warm bed at 6 a.m.
Instead, you must anchor your daily habits to your core non-negotiable values. Do you want to have the physical energy and mobility to get down on the floor and play with your grandchildren?
Do you want to maintain your physical independence and avoid a nursing home in your 80s?
Do you want the mental clarity to pursue a passion project after work? When your decisions are tethered to those profound, deeply held values, the entire paradigm shifts.
It transforms health from a superficial chore, a box to be checked off, into a necessary investment in the exact life you want to live. The why becomes the ultimate system.
So let's step back and look at the incredible journey we've just taken, guided by what was ostensibly just an English language lesson.
It really is a brilliant text.
We started by examining the universal failure of white-knuckling our way through health, realizing that relying on finite willpower just leads to the tragic graveyard of good intentions. We then explored how to bypass that willpower depletion by holistically integrating movement through low-barrier exercise snacks, shifting our baseline away from the dormant danger of our sedentary lives.
We moved into the foundational necessity of energy, uncovering how the insidious nature of sleep deprivation fundamentally rewires our hormones, spikes our cortisol, induces insulin resistance, and drives the brain to hunt for dopamine and sugar.
We navigated the psychological minefield of the modern food environment, recognizing that wearables and gamification can easily become a double-edged sword that spikes our anxiety.
We learned to use tracking data not as a lifelong prison, but as a temporary tool to recalibrate our broken intuition, ultimately striving for intuitive eating and escaping the behavioral trap of the forbidden fruit.
We uncovered the vital, mechanical link between the mind and the body, understanding the evolutionary role of the vagus nerve. We saw how chronic psychological stress literally shunts blood away from the gut, shutting down digestion, and how deep breathing acts as a mechanical manual override to restore our parasympathetic state.
And finally, we learned how to curate our reality to support these biological truths. We discussed building bulletproof systems that protect us from the unpredictable weather of our motivation, aggressively editing our physical environments to make the healthy choice effortless, embracing the vulnerability of being a novice to build active communities, and anchoring every action to our deepest, most profound core values.
It is a comprehensive, biologically sound blueprint for sustainable vitality. And if we accept this blueprint, if we accept that our environment dictates our behavior, and that wellness is an expansion of our capabilities rather than a restriction, it leaves us with a critical, overarching perspective to consider.
What if we stopped looking at health as a separate, isolated category of our lives? What if we stopped seeing it as a chore we have to schedule and started viewing it simply as the foundational lens through which we design our homes, choose our friendships, and curate our daily joy? If you audited your environment tomorrow so that the vibrant, dynamic choice was the only effortless choice available, what would you suddenly have the energy to achieve?
The energy to achieve whatever matters most to you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a moment to look at your own daily friction points. Step out of the punishing all-or-nothing mindset and maybe run one small, guilt-free experiment on your routine today. We will see you next time. Right now, at this exact second, the chemical deciding whether you feel happy or anxious or just completely overwhelmed, it isn't actually being manufactured in your brain.
No, it's being built in your intestines.
Which is wild. Welcome to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about mental resilience or long-term vitality, or really just the sheer ability to get through a Tuesday without wanting to throw your laptop out a window.
Right, yeah.
There is this underlying cultural expectation that it all comes down to willpower. It gets treated like this muscle you just have to flex harder.
Exactly.
Like you feel stressed, push through it, you feel exhausted. Just grab a double shot of espresso and white-knuckle your way to the weekend.
Which is, it's an incredibly simplistic, almost Victorian view of human endurance.
Yeah.
The assumption is that your conscious mind is the undisputed captain of the ship. And if the ship is currently taking on water, it's simply because the captain isn't yelling orders loudly enough from the bridge.
It's a comforting illusion, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
We desperately want to believe we're in total conscious control of our biological operating system. But the research we're unpacking today completely shatters that illusion.
It really does.
We're looking at a landscape of human health that is vastly more intricate, driven by forces we can't even see in the mirror. We have a massive stack of clinical data and biological research today focusing on these invisible pillars of health.
Right. We're talking about gut microbiology, the actual physical structures of mental resilience, and frankly, the highly ironic traps of modern wellness culture.
Exactly. So if you're listening to this right now and feeling just completely overwhelmed by the constant influx of conflicting health advice,
which everyone is,
right, where one day a food is a superfood and the next day it's a biohazard, well, we're going to strip all of that noise away.
Our mission today is to really look under the hood. The data doesn't just give us a superficial list of do's and don'ts. It provides this foundational framework for how your body and mind are actively communicating at a cellular level.
Which is what we're going to examine. The why and the how beneath the surface level health trends.
Because once you understand the actual biological mechanics of that communication, you can start to take back control in an environment that is, quite frankly, brilliantly engineered to stress you out.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to jump right into the deepest, most surprising, invisible ecosystem of them all.
The gut.
Yeah. When I say invisible ecosystem, your mind probably jumps to the Amazon rainforest or, I don't know, a deep-sea thermal vent.
Sure.
But the science pulls us right back into the dark, incredibly crowded confines of our own digestive tracts.
The microbiome.
The human gut microbiome. And it's actually really fascinating to look at the historical context here.
How so?
Well, just 15 or 20 years ago, if a researcher started passionately advocating that the bacteria in your colon were dictating your mood,
they'd be considered crazy. Literally laughed out of a neurology conference. It was considered the absolute fringe of alternative medicine. It was largely ignored by the mainstream medical establishment who they preferred to view the gastrointestinal tract as basically a simple plumbing system.
Right. Food goes in, nutrients are extracted, waste goes out, end of story.
Exactly.
And now it is the absolute center of gravity in physiological research. I mean, the data notes, we now understand this symbiotic relationship with the trillions of microbes. And we are talking about roughly 38 trillion bacterial cells here.
Which actually outnumber our own human cells, by the way.
Which is terrifying and amazing. They're the control center for our immune system.
Yeah.
And wildly for our emotional state.
Yeah.
We are not just a single organism.
No, we are a super organism. I think the analogy of a walking, talking coral reef is probably the most biologically accurate way to describe a human being.
A coral reef walking around in sneakers. I love that.
Right. You are hosting trillions of non-human entities, thousands of different species of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and they're all actively metabolizing, reproducing, and secreting chemicals that dictate how you feel on any given morning.
And the crux of this, the really startling data point that forces a complete paradigm shift, centers on the neurotransmitter serotonin.
Yes, the heavy hitter.
This is the fact that forces you to rethink everything. The research confirms that up to 90% of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut, not the brain.
Right.
90%. And serotonin is the primary neurotransmitter responsible for feelings of well-being, happiness, emotional stability. I mean, it's the exact chemical that most modern SSRI antidepressants are designed to keep circulating in your synapses.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, for decades, the traditional medical and psychiatric paradigm has treated mood disorders. Anxiety, clinical depression, chronic low mood, almost exclusively as a neck-up problem.
Just a chemical imbalance isolated within the brain.
Exactly. But the biological reality forces us to look much lower down the chain. If 90% of that critical neurotransmitter is being synthesized in the gastrointestinal tract by these specialized cells called enterochromaffin cells.
Enterochromaffin cells. Got it.
Yeah, which are heavily regulated by your gut bacteria, then the state of that intestinal environment isn't just a side note. It's the main event.
Okay, wait, let me stop you there because I know there is a major technical caveat here that a lot of pop science articles just completely gloss over.
Oh, the blood-brain barrier.
Yes. It's not like the serotonin produced in the gut just floats up into the brain, right? Doesn't the blood-brain barrier prevent that?
That is a critical distinction, and you're absolutely correct. The serotonin manufactured in your gut does not cross the blood-brain barrier. It cannot directly enter the brain to make you feel happy.
Okay, so what does this all mean? If it can't get to the brain, Why do we care that 90% of it is made in the gut? How does it actually affect our mood?
Well, this is where the mechanics of the gut-brain axis become truly incredible. The gut-derived serotonin acts locally to regulate intestinal movements and secretions. But, and this is the key part, it also interacts directly with the afferentine nerve endings of the vagus nerve.
The vagus nerve.
Right. Think of the vagus nerve as a massive fiber optic cable connecting your gut directly to your brainstem. When those gut microbes help produce serotonin, or when they ferment dietary fiber into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate.
They're essentially sending signals up that cable.
Precisely. They are sending electrical and chemical signals up that fiber optic cable.
So they're basically texting the brain.
They really are. They send signals up the vagus nerve that tell the brain, hey, conditions down here are optimal, resources are plentiful, there are no pathogens.
And then the brain gets that text.
Right. The brain receives that signal and, in response, synthesizes its own serotonin internally while simultaneously lowering neuroinflammation. So the gut doesn't ship the finished product to the brain. It sends the critical instructions and the all-clear signal that allows the brain to do its job.
I love that. Let's build a visual for everyone listening. If the gut is the factory floor where the raw materials are processed, the vagus nerve is the fiber optic cable transmitting the operational data to the brain's headquarters.
That's a great way to look at it.
You can have a perfectly healthy, pristine headquarters up in the brain. But if that fiber optic cable is constantly transmitting distress signals, fire alarms, and inventory shortages from a burning factory floor down below,
the headquarters is going to hit the panic button.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you experience that panic consciously as anxiety or depression. The problem isn't the headquarters. The problem is the supply chain.
And that brings us to the concept of dysbiosis, which is what happens when that factory floor catches fire.
Right. Dysbiosis.
Yeah, dysbiosis is a state where the microbial ecosystem becomes imbalanced. The pathogenic or bad bacteria outnumber the beneficial strains, or just the overall diversity of the microbiome plummets. And when this happens, the communication up the vagus nerve radically changes.
So how exactly does that happen? Because we hear the word inflammation thrown around constantly.
Yeah.
How does a bad diet actually cause this structural breakdown?
Well, let's look at it at the cellular level. Inside your colon, there is a very thin single-cell layer of epithelial cells.
Okay.
Think of it like a microscopic chain-link fence. And on top of that fence is a thick layer of mucus, which acts as a moat, keeping the trillions of bacteria safely away from your bloodstream.
A moat and a fence. Got it.
When you consume highly processed foods, emulsifiers, or massive amounts of refined sugar, you are selectively feeding pathogenic bacterial strains that thrive on that junk.
You are basically arming the enemy?
You really are. And as those pathogenic strains multiply, they outcompete the good bacteria that normally produce those protective short-chain fatty acids. Without those fatty acids, the mucus moat dries up.
Oh, wow. So the moat is gone.
Exactly. The pathogenic bacteria then get right up against the chain-link fence, those epithelial cells, and they release endotoxins, specifically something called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS.
LPS.
Right. These toxins physically degrade the proteins holding the fence together, causing what we call increased intestinal permeability.
Which is leaky gut.
Exactly. Leaky gut. The fence breaks open. Now, microscopic food particles and bacterial toxins are leaking directly into your bloodstream.
That sounds terrible.
It is. Your immune system, which has about 70% of its forces stationed right behind that gut wall, detects these invaders and just goes into high alert. It triggers massive systemic inflammation.
And that inflammation doesn't just stay in the gut.
No, this inflammatory cytokine storm travels up to the brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and causes neuroinflammation. Your brain literally inflames. This alters how it processes emotions and drastically reduces its ability to utilize serotonin.
So think about this. When you're having a terrible day, your boss sends a passive-aggressive email, you get a flat tire in the rain. What is our cultural default?
We eat.
We reach for comfort food. We don't crave a spinach salad. We crave a massive, sugary, trans-fat-laden pastry or a deep dish pizza.
Right, because biochemically, we have been conditioned to seek the rapid dopamine hit that highly palatable, ultra-processed food provides. It temporarily masks the psychological stress.
But look at the profound biological irony of what is actually happening. It is the ultimate maladaptive coping mechanism.
Truly.
You eat the pastry to soothe the anxiety of the bad day. But that pastry feeds the pathogenic bacteria. They destroy the mucus layer. The tight junctions open up. Toxins flood your bloodstream.
Systemic inflammation spikes.
Yes, which travels to your brain, shuts down internal serotonin production and actively generates more anxiety.
Yeah.
You are literally feeding the biological machinery of anxiety in a desperate attempt to cure your psychological anxiety.
You're basically treating a short-term psychological discomfort by detonating a bomb in your primary mood-regulating ecosystem.
It's so counterproductive.
It is. When you understand the cellular mechanics of dysbiosis, you start to view that donut not just as a collection of empty calories or a diet cheat day, but as biological code. You are typing a line of highly inflammatory code directly into your nervous system.
Which fundamentally changes how you relate to what you put on your plate.
Yeah.
Shifts it away from this punitive, restrictive diet mentality of, oh, I'm not allowed to have sugar, to a protective mentality of, I don't want to sabotage my own fiber optic communication system.
Exactly. It's empowering.
But we need to keep pulling this thread, because the internal stress we put on our gut through our diet is really only half the battle, right?
Right.
The dysbiosis doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is being violently accelerated by the external environment we are forced to navigate every single day.
Which brings us to the physiological concept of the allostatic load.
Allostatic load. It sounds like an engineering term.
Yeah.
Like the weight-bearing capacity of a bridge or something.
Well, it is essentially an engineering term applied to biology. Allostatic load is the cumulative systemic burden of chronic stress and life events on the body.
The wear and tear.
Exactly. It is the physiological wear and tear that accumulates as an individual is exposed to repeated or chronic stress. And to understand why this load is currently crushing us, we really have to look closely at the architecture of the human nervous system, specifically the HPA axis.
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Let's break that down, because I think a lot of people assume stress is just, a tight feeling in their chest, not a cascading chemical waterfall.
Right. Let's look at acute stress first. For the vast majority of our evolutionary history, stressors were acute, physical, and highly consequential.
Like a tiger.
Exactly. You are foraging on the savannah, and you spot a predator. The amygdala in your brain perceives the threat and instantly sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus.
Oh, yeah.
The hypothalamus then releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH.
That's the first domino falling.
Yes. That CRH travels a tiny distance to the pituitary gland, telling it to secrete ACTH into your bloodstream. That ACTH travels all the way down to your adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, and basically screams at them to release adrenaline and cortisol.
And this is where the physical magic happens, right?
Sure.
Your heart rate skyrockets to pump oxygen to your muscles. Your pupils dilate to take in more light.
And crucially, tying back to our last point, your body completely shuts down gastrointestinal motility.
Because digesting the berries you ate for lunch is a zero priority task when you're about to become someone else's lunch.
Exactly. All blood is shunted away from the gut. It is a magnificent, perfectly orchestrated biological response designed to keep you alive for the next 10 minutes. You either fight the predator or you run.
Fight or flight.
Right. But the most important part of this entire evolutionary sequence is what happens next. The event ends. Assuming you survive, the threat is removed.
The tiger leaves.
Yes. The HPA axis has a built-in negative feedback loop. Once cortisol levels get high enough, they signal the brain to shut the system down. The cortisol clears, your heart rate drops, blood returns to your gut, and you return to baseline. You return to homeostasis.
Okay, here's where I have to push back, or at least play devil's advocate for the listener. We always use this tiger analogy. But didn't our grandparents and great-grandparents face massive stressors?
Of course.
I mean, they lived through the Great Depression, World Wars, actual famine. High stress is like an overflowing inbox and a fluctuating stock portfolio. Why is modern life considered biologically worse? Is allostatic load just a trendy buzzword for the exact same human suffering we've always dealt with?
That is a phenomenal question. And the distinction lies entirely in the duration and the nature of the arousal.
Laceration.
Yes. During the Great Depression, the stress was severe, absolutely. But there were still profound periods of community-based parasympathetic recovery. People sat on porches, they engaged in physical labor that metabolized the stress hormones, the sun went down, and the world grew quiet.
The threat was episodic.
Exactly. Modern life, however, has engineered an environment of continuous low-grade hyperarousal.
So the tiger never leaves the room.
The tiger has moved into your pocket and buzzes every 4 minutes.
Oh, man.
Your brain's amygdala cannot differentiate between the existential threat of a predator and the perceived social or financial threat of an angry email from your boss at 9:30 p.m. or the barrage of catastrophic news you scroll through right before bed. The threat is abstract, constant, and inescapable.
So the HPA axis never gets the signal to shut down.
Exactly. You are experiencing a slow, steady, relentless drip of cortisol. And look, cortisol is not inherently bad. It is necessary to wake you up in the morning. But chronic exposure to cortisol is highly toxic.
It wears you down.
Over time, the receptors in your brain, specifically in the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory and emotion, become desensitized. The negative feedback loop breaks. You lose the ability to turn the stress response off.
This perfectly explains the biological mechanics behind that feeling of being wired but tired. I know everyone listening knows this feeling.
Oh, absolutely.
You are utterly exhausted, your bones ache with fatigue, but when you lie down to sleep, your heart is racing and your mind is buzzing with electric anxiety. You are a biological engine that has run out of gas, but the accelerator is permanently pinned to the floor.
Functionally, your diurnal cortisol curve has flattened. Normally, cortisol should peak in the morning to wake you up and drop to its lowest point at night to allow for sleep. But under high allostatic load, your cortisol stays artificially elevated at night.
Wow.
And remember what we said about blood being shunted away from the gut during stress?
Yeah, to run from the tiger.
Right. If you are chronically stressed, your gut is in a permanent state of low blood flow. The mucus layer degrades simply from a lack of resources, allowing the dysbiosis we talked about earlier to run rampant, even if your diet is perfect.
So the friction of modern life is physically grinding down our biological reserves. It's suppressing the immune system, destroying the gut lining, and shrinking the hippocampus. It is structural damage, not just a bad mood.
Correct.
So what does this all mean? The multi-million-dollar question. How on earth does an average person with a mortgage, a commute, and a smartphone actually survive an environment that is fundamentally incompatible with our ancient nervous systems? Because we can't all abandon our jobs and move to a remote cabin in the woods.
No, we cannot change the macro environment, which means we have to hack our internal response to it. We have to learn how to manually pull the physiological brake.
Pulling the brake.
Yes. And the data points overwhelmingly to one of the most effective yet misunderstood mechanisms for doing this. Somatic practices.
Somatic practices. The word somatic simply refers to the body. So instead of trying to use our stressed out mind to calm down our body, we use our body to forcefully calm down our mind.
Precisely. If your allostatic load is high and your brain is swimming in cortisol and adrenaline, your prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational part of your brain, is essentially offline.
You can't think your way out of it.
You cannot think your way out of a panic attack. Logic does not work on an activated amygdala. You have to speak the language of the nervous system. And the most direct dialect of that language is breathing, specifically deep diaphragmatic breathing.
Let's be honest. When someone is stressed and someone else says, hey, just take a deep breath, it feels incredibly dismissive.
It does.
It feels like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. I have 400 unread emails, my car is making a terrifying noise, and my kid is screaming. Taking a breath isn't going to...
And psychologically, you are right to feel annoyed. But biologically, we aren't talking about taking a breath as a cute, relaxing spa day concept. We are talking about manipulating biomechanics to force a chemical shift.
Okay, break that down.
To understand this, we have to look at the anatomy of the nervus vagus, the 10th cranial nerve.
Fiber optic cable we talked about earlier.
Yes. But what's fascinating here is the directional flow of that cable. About 80% of the nerve fibers in the vagus nerve are afferent, meaning they travel up from the body to the brain. Only 20% are efferent, traveling down from the brain to the body.
Wait, really?
Yes.
So the body is sending 4 times as much information to the brain as the brain is sending to the body.
Exactly. This is why somatic practices work. Your brain is a receiver constantly polling the body to ask, are we safe? The vagus nerve wanders down from the brainstem through the neck and branches out across the heart, the lungs, and the diaphragm, all the way down to the intestines.
Okay, so how does moving air in and out of my lungs actually interact with that nerve?
When you engage in diaphragmatic breathing, meaning you are breathing deep into your belly, causing it to expand rather than taking shallow, panicked breaths into your upper chest, you are doing 2 physical things.
Okay.
First, the physical expansion of the diaphragm places gentle pressure on the vagus nerve. Second, you are stimulating stretch receptors and baroreceptors in the lung tissue and the blood vessels.
So you are physically massaging the nerve from the inside.
You are mechanically activating it. When these receptors are stretched slowly, they send an immediate electrical signal up those afferent fibers to the brainstem. The brainstem responds by releasing acetylcholine, a powerful neurotransmitter, directly onto the sinoatrial node of your heart.
The heart's natural pacemaker.
Yes. Acetylcholine acts as a chemical brake. It instantly decelerates your heart rate. It literally forces the body to shift out of the sympathetic fight-or-flight dominance and pulls it into the parasympathetic rest and digest state.
Rest and digest.
This directly improves your heart rate variability, or HRV, which is a key metric of nervous system resilience.
Here is the analogy. Think of a commercial airliner caught in a steep nosedive because the automated autopilot computer, your cortisol-soaked brain, has malfunctioned and thinks plunging toward the earth is the correct maneuver.
A terrifying thought, but accurate.
Right. The pilot doesn't try to reason with the computer code. The pilot reaches over and pulls a heavy physical manual override lever to pull the nose of the plane up. Deep, slow belly breathing is that physical lever.
Exactly.
You are bypassing the panicked cognitive loops entirely and directly commanding your cardiovascular system to stand down. You are sending a massive, unignorable biological signal upward saying the breathing is slow and deep. We are safe. Terminate the cortisol drip.
It is remarkably empowering. You have a built-in mechanism to lower your allostatic load, freely available at any moment, requiring zero equipment.
But there's a massive catch. A tragedy, really, that the data highlights.
Yeah.
The sheer mindfulness, the tiny 10-second window of attentional focus required to simply pause, recognize you are stressed, and execute this manual breathing override. That attention is being fiercely, aggressively competed for.
Constantly.
And the primary competitor is the very thing causing the stress.
The smartphone, the digital delivery device of the modern allostatic load.
We are trying to breathe our way out of chronic stress, but the device we interact with hundreds of times a day is specifically engineered by neurobiologists in Silicon Valley to hijack our attention and keep our sympathetic nervous system engaged.
It's quite the trap.
Which brings us to the next major pillar of our deep dive. The toxic labyrinth of modern wellness culture. The digital elephant in the room.
It is the great paradox of the information age. On one hand, you and I are sitting here analyzing the afferent fibers of the vagus nerve and the mucosal lining of the gut because we have democratized access to the greatest library of biological data in human history.
We understand human physiology better than any generation before us.
Yet, simultaneously, we are statistically more anxious, more metabolically dysfunctional, and more confused about how to simply live than we were 40 years ago. Having an ocean of data does not automatically equate to possessing an ounce of wisdom.
And nowhere is this more evident than in the online wellness space, which the research identifies as an algorithm-driven echo chamber. The smartphone is delivering the disease disguised as the cure.
That's a great way to phrase it. It really is a minefield.
Let's break down the mechanics of this because it's insidious. We use our phones to seek a quick hit of dopamine, a distraction from the friction of the day. But the algorithm, which optimizes for engagement and outrage, serves up an impossible, hyper-curated standard of biological perfection.
The toxic positivity.
Yes. You open an app at 6:30 a.m., bleary-eyed, and immediately you are served a cinematic video of an influencer who woke up at 4 a.m., drank a proprietary adaptogenic matcha blend, did 45 minutes of red light therapy, plunged into an ice bath, and ran a half marathon, all while maintaining perfect skin and a serene smile.
What is happening biologically to the person watching that video?
Rather than a dopamine hit, their brain receives a massive cortisol spike of social comparison and existential inadequacy before their feet even hit the floor.
Exactly. When we view those hyper-optimized routines, it activates the default mode network in the brain, specifically areas associated with social threat and status assessment.
Social threat.
Right. Evolutionarily, if you were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, your survival was threatened. The brain interprets this massive disparity between your reality, waking up tired, needing to pack a school lunch, hitting snooze, and the influencer's reality as a literal threat to your social survival.
So the comparison trap isn't just a bad mood, it is an AGPA axis trigger. You are generating allostatic load by watching someone else pretend to be perfectly healthy.
This leads to a condition known as orthorexia, an unhealthy, obsessive preoccupation with healthy living. And the biological irony here is devastating. Well, let's say you force yourself to buy the expensive adaptogens and you make the incredibly bitter green smoothie every morning because you were told it is optimal for your microbiome.
Okay.
But you hate the paste, you are stressed about the financial cost of the ingredients, and you feel a deep, gnawing anxiety if you miss a single day of your protocol.
Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when you drink that smoothie in a state of stress?
If you consume that nutrient-dense smoothie while your HPA axis is activated by the anxiety of trying to be perfect, your body is in sympathetic dominance.
Fight or flight.
Yes. As we established, blood flow to the gut is restricted. Digestive enzymes are suppressed. Your body literally cannot properly absorb or assimilate the vitamins and antioxidants in that smoothie because the digestive machinery is powered down.
Oh, wow.
The cortisol you generated stressing over the routine is causing more cellular damage than the smoothie could ever possibly repair.
The pursuit of health has literally become its own toxic allostatic load. We are stressing ourselves to the point of metabolic dysfunction in our desperate attempt to become immortal. It is absolutely maddening.
The nervous system does not differentiate between the stress of being chased by a predator and the stress of worrying if your magnesium supplement is sufficiently bioavailable. The chemical wear and tear, the degradation of the hippocampus, the flattening of the cortisol curve is identical.
So what does this all mean for the listener? How do you navigate a digital landscape that is actively weaponizing your desire to be healthy against you?
You have to become discerning.
The actionable takeaway here is blunt. You must become a ruthlessly discerning consumer of biological information.
Curating your digital environment is no longer a luxury. It is a fundamental act of biological self-preservation, just as critical as curating your physical diet.
If you follow an account, even if they have a medical degree from a prestigious university, even if they have 10 million followers and a best-selling book, and their content consistently makes you feel guilty, inadequate, or anxious about your own body or your daily choices, unfollow them. Block them.
Don't let them in.
Right. Do not let a stranger monetize your allostatic load. Protect your mental ecosystem with absolute, unapologetic ferocity.
Because if we're constantly trapped in that state of comparison, hyperoptimization, and anxiety, we entirely lose sight of what the actual end goal of all this effort is.
Which perfectly transitions us to the final and arguably most profound paradigm shift in the data. If we strip away the fads, the influence culture, the biohacking gadgets, and the anxiety of optimization, what are we actually trying to achieve?
What is the actual biological objective?
Right. What is the point of the fermented foods, the early bedtimes, and the vagus nerve breathing? Are we just trying to run the clock up? Are we trying to live to be 130 years old just to say we did it?
Historically, yes.
The clinical focus has undergone a massive reorientation over the last few years. For the entire 20th century, the medical establishment was obsessed with one singular metric: extending lifespan.
Lifespan is a purely chronological metric. It is simply the raw number of years, months, and days your heart continues to circulate blood. And thanks to incredible advancements in antibiotics, sanitation, and acute surgical interventions, we have been wildly successful at pushing that number higher.
But the focus has crucially shifted away from extending lifespan to optimizing health span.
Health span, the portion of your life during which you are biologically vibrant, functionally autonomous, and free from serious, debilitating chronic disease.
It's not just how long you live, but how well you live.
It is the qualitative measurement of aging. To understand why this shift is so vital, we have to look at the cellular mechanics of aging.
Why do we age?
It is a combination of factors: the shortening of telomeres at the ends of our chromosomes, the gradual dysfunction of our mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells, and the accumulation of senescent cells.
Zombie cells.
Exactly. Cells that have stopped dividing but refuse to die, secreting inflammatory markers that damage surrounding tissue. Historically, as modern medicine extended our lifespans, it inadvertently extended the period where these cellular degradations take their toll. We create a massive gap between health span and lifespan.
The data poses a brutal hypothetical. What good is it to push your lifespan to 95 years old if the final 20 years of that life are marred by severe neurodegeneration, the complete loss of physical mobility, endless pharmaceutical interventions, and the total loss of your independence?
We added years to life, but we forgot to add life to those years.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal, the concept of compressing morbidity. Morbidity refers to that period of illness, physical decline, and loss of function at the end of life.
Right.
The goal of compressing morbidity is a profound acceptance of our biology. It acknowledges that cellular decline and eventual death are inevitable. We are not aiming for Silicon Valley immortality here, but we are aiming to engineer our biology so that the inevitable period of decline is as brutally short as humanly possible.
We want to square the curve.
Squaring the curve, exactly. Instead of a long, agonizing 2-decade slope downward into frailty, You want the graph of your vitality to stay high, flat, and robust for decades, and then drop off steeply at the very end.
Yes.
You want to be 88 years old, still possessing the VO2 max and muscle torque required to hike a trail, still able to get down on the floor to play with your great-grandkids, and, crucially, possess the fast twitch muscle fiber to get back up unassisted.
Autonomy.
You want your cognitive faculties sharp. And then at 92, your systems just rapidly power down and you go to sleep. You compress the sickness into a tiny fraction of your overall timeline.
This raises an important question. How does deeply understanding the mechanics of morbidity compression shift our daily motivation? When you visualize that graph, the why behind healthy habits completely transforms.
It strips away all the superficial vanity of the wellness industry. It is no longer about whether you have low enough body fat to look shredded for an Instagram photo or fitting into a specific size of denim. It becomes a deeply profound mission of maintaining your fundamental human autonomy.
Precisely. You aren't doing heavy resistance training to look like a fitness model. You are engaging in mechanical tension to increase bone mineral density and muscle mass so that a simple fall at age 75 doesn't result in a fractured hip.
Which is a massive statistical predictor of mortality.
Exactly. You aren't eating fermented foods and focusing on short-chain fatty acids because it's trendy. You are doing it to maintain a fortified gut lining that prevents the neuroinflammation associated with Alzheimer's and cognitive decline.
You are building biological armor. The choices you make today, the sleep hygiene that allows your brain to literally wash away amyloid plaques via the lymphatic system, the stress management that protects your hippocampus, the nutrition that fuels your microbiome, they are compound interest for your biological retirement account.
Compound interest, that's a great way to think of it.
You are putting pennies in the bank today so that future you isn't bankrupt and dependent on others. It is an act of profound respect for your future self.
And how you invest those pennies is entirely dependent on your unique physiological makeup. The data heavily emphasizes the concept of bio-individuality,
which completely destroys the dogma of the one-size-fits-all diet book industry. Bio-individuality is the biological fact that you are an entirely unique entity.
You must be the CEO of your own body.
Right. Your microbiome composition is as distinct as your fingerprint. Your genetic predispositions, your epigenetic expression based on your childhood environment, your current allostatic load, none of it is exactly like anyone else's on the planet.
This explains why nutritional epidemiology is so incredibly confusing for the public. A strict ketogenic diet might work miraculously for your neighbor, healing their metabolic dysfunction and giving them boundless energy. But because of your specific genetic variants regarding fat metabolism or the specific strains of bacteria in your gut, that exact same diet might cause your thyroid to crash, spike your LDL cholesterol, and leave you exhausted.
You cannot outsource the executive function of your health to an influencer or a guru. You have to become the lead scientist of your own body. You have to observe, run N-of-1 experiments on yourself, and ruthlessly discard what doesn't serve your unique biology, regardless of how many podcasts claim it's the ultimate biohack. Small things.
Small things. It is choosing the complex carbohydrate over the simple sugar 80% of the time, and enjoying the pastry the other 20% of the time without generating a cortisol spike of guilt.
Right.
A resilient, adaptable immune system and a compressed morbidity curve are not built in a radical weekend retreat. They are built in the quiet, unremarkable, consistent choices of daily life.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of biological territory today.
Yeah.
Let's synthesize the absolute bedrock takeaways for everyone listening.
Sounds good.
First, you have to respect the gut-brain axis. Recognize that you are a superorganism. Your brain and your microbiome are in constant bidirectional communication via the vagus nerve. 90% of your serotonin relies on you maintaining the integrity of that intestinal mucus layer and not feeding the pathogenic bacteria that cause structural leaks and systemic inflammation.
Second, you must actively manage and lower your allostatic load. Acknowledge that your ancient HPA axis treats a notification on your phone the same way it treats a physical threat, flooding your system with cortisol and halting your digestion.
The tiger in your pocket.
Right. Use somatic practices, specifically deep diaphragmatic breathing, to physically activate the stretch receptors that release acetylcholine, manually pulling the brake pedal on your sympathetic nervous system and signaling safety to your brain.
Third, aggressively protect your physiological peace from the digital wellness machine. The pursuit of perfect health can ironically become the very stressor that destroys your health. Curate your feeds, understand the biological damage of the comparison trap, and refuse to participate in an ecosystem that makes you feel fundamentally flawed for simply being human.
And finally, reframe your entire biological objective. Shift your focus away from the vanity of extending lifespan and toward the functional autonomy of optimizing health span.
Compressing morbidity.
Exactly. Aim to compress morbidity by building incremental daily habits that act as compound interest for your long-term vitality, honoring your unique bio-individuality and ditching the perfectionist mindset.
So what does this actually look like for you tomorrow morning? We want to issue a very manageable challenge based on this deep dive. Do not try to overhaul your entire life. Do not throw out everything in your pantry.
Please don't.
Implement just one microscopic change this week. Maybe spend 10 minutes tonight ruthlessly pruning your social media feed, unfollowing any account that spikes your heart rate or induces guilt.
That's a great start.
Or maybe the next time you feel that wired but tired overwhelm at your desk, close your laptop, put your hand on your belly, and take 5 deep breaths to manually override your vagus nerve.
Biological transformation is always rooted in the accumulation of small, consistent signals of safety.
Exactly. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to chew on. Something that builds on everything we've unpacked regarding allostatic load and the HPA axis.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking about individual responsibility, curating your feed, eating the right fibers for your microbiome, breathing through the stress. But if chronic, low-grade hyperarousal and our highly processed, screen-dominated environment are the primary drivers of gut dysbiosis, systemic inflammation, and a shortened health span, is the ultimate future of medicine going to look less like a pharmacy of pills or even a library of breathing techniques, and more like fundamental architectural and societal engineering?
Oh, wow.
Think about it. Can we ever truly successfully out-meditate or biohack our way out of a societal structure that is fundamentally biologically hostile to our ancient operating systems? Or do we eventually have to change the design of the world to save our biology?
That is a profound question regarding the absolute limits of individual physiological adaptation.
Something to ponder the next time you are stuck in gridlock traffic, breathing deeply into your diaphragm to save your serotonin. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you walk away feeling a little more scientifically empowered, a lot less guilty, and deeply in tune with the invisible ecosystems keeping you alive. Protect your gut lining, pull the manual override lever when you need it, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.